Lights. 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 Okay, good to go. Now, there's a lot of Americans in this audience. Most of you probably know little or nothing about the involvement of what I refer to as our forgotten allies in the Pacific War, namely the Australians, the New Zealanders, the Dutch early in the war, the British also, but more so during the last year of the war, and people like the Philippines, and I haven't been drinking. I'm going to hang on. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. I'm only going to touch on a few things because there was so much going on in this theater like in other theaters throughout the war, but I can only touch on them. But I do have some follow-up lectures that will give you more detail about not just Australia and New Zealand in the Pacific War, but how they interacted, especially with U.S. troops under General MacArthur. I like these photos because the population of New Zealand at the time was only about 1.6 million, but they contributed, and I'm getting mixed numbers when I try to find, but somewhere between 12 and 15,000 New Zealanders served just in the Air Arm. That's not just in the New Zealand Air Force, but also in Bomber Command in Europe. Australia, with about 7 million people, they had a number of divisions. They also had ships that they contributed. They served also on Royal Navy ships. They served in the Air Arm. But most of their able-bodied men in both Australia and New Zealand were serving in New Zealand or in North Africa and the Middle East at the time of Japan's entry into the war. And I always like to dedicate this to Mackenzie Gregory. Even before he had any thoughts of moving to the Southern Hemisphere, when I was researching a book about the role that naval officers played in the Pacific War, somebody introduced me to Mac, as he likes to be called. And so I interviewed him, and he really gave me a perspective on how stressful it was for somebody in the Australian or the New Zealand Navy to find themselves under U.S. naval command. Because even though Australian and New Zealand forces were serving with U.S. forces, the U.S. military was an overall command, whether it was in the Central Pacific or in the Southwest Pacific. The only part of the Pacific that was under the command of a U.S. Army general, and that was Douglas MacArthur. But he was trained to do things the Royal Navy way, and they had a different system of signals, communication. Their flags were different, and he served aboard HMAS Canberra, and that was one of 4 heavy cruisers that was lost in a matter of minutes at the Battle of Savo Island in August 1942, when the Marines had just landed on Guadalcanal. Still considered one of the greatest naval disaster in U.S. naval history to this day. But he was aboard that and survived it, and then later served on HMAS Australia, another Australian ship, British built, of course. But in his oral history, he made it sound learning how to do things the U.S. Navy way almost as stressful as being in combat. Because he said literally overnight I had to forget everything I had learned, everything I had been taught, and learn how to do things the U.S. Navy way. Things like simply if you're in a task force formation and you're all going to turn, say, 30 degrees to starboard at the same time, the U.S. Navy way did it a little bit different than the Royal Navy way. And I was wondering how they managed to compensate for these 2 different systems. And I later learned that they would put U.S. military naval personnel on all the Australian and New Zealand ships. They might have signalmen, quartermasters, and other ratings so that they could work in tandem with their counterparts and teach them how to do things the U.S. Navy way. So it was sort of a mentoring program, and apparently it worked out quite well. But he died a few years ago. He has a website called Mac Ahoy. It has a lot of useful information about Australian maritime history. One of his sons contacted me and after his father died and said they were going to keep the site going. And I'm going to show this map again, not because you're ignorant of geography, as I might have suggested earlier, but I just want to give you an idea that for the most part, Australian ground troops were confined pretty much to Papua New Guinea area throughout the war. There were some New Zealand, Australian naval forces working in the Solomons, as well as people in the air arm, both Australia and New Zealand. And I can't talk about this without mentioning these two men. Now, if you're an Australian, you probably know about General Thomas Blamey, right? Are there any Australians here? No Australians? What the hell am I giving this lecture for then? Okay. And Douglas MacArthur, right? Everybody's heard of Douglas MacArthur. Somebody get on the horn and get some Australians down here. Anyway, but Thomas Blamey, this is where I get hung up. I can talk all day about these guys, and then my 45 minutes is up, so I better just touch on a few things. But Thomas Blamey, he started off as a school teacher. When the war came along, he went into the military. He served in World War I in Europe, and both his superiors in the British Army and the Australian Army recognized him as a very talented individual, an outstanding Army officer. He could organize men. He was a great strategist. But after the war was over, he left the Army, went back to Australia, worked as a police commissioner in Victoria. But when World War II came along, he went back on active duty. He served with Allied forces in Greece and Crete. And then after Crete, Prime Minister Curtin called him back to Australia to take command of all Australian forces in Australia. It was in March of 1942. Douglas MacArthur was in the Philippines, and the president ordered him to escape and come down to Australia to take command of all Allied forces in Australia. But when he got there, he didn't find much in the way of Allied forces. Now, unlike Blamey, though, Douglas MacArthur literally was born into the Army. His father was a Medal of Honor recipient in the American Civil War and stayed in the Army practically all the rest of his life, was involved in, went to the Philippines after they were taken in the Spanish-American Wars, involved in what the Americans called the Philippine Insurrection, but what the Philippines called their War of Independence, depends on whose side you were. So he and his mother literally followed his career from the day he was born until the day she died. And she didn't die until 1935, right after he retired from the U.S. Army for the first time. He went to West Point, and when he got there, his mother rented an apartment right outside West Point with a view inside his dorm window. And at one point, one of his other fellow cadets asked young MacArthur if he'd like to be his roommate while at West Point, and his response was, "I don't know, I have to ask my mom first." Now, he went on to become the youngest brigadier general to fight in the World War I in Europe. He was gassed. He was decorated for heroism a number of times. He then became the commandant of West Point after the war and revamped the whole curriculum to make it more modern. Under Hoover, President Hoover, he became Army Chief of Staff, and he stayed on even after Franklin Roosevelt was elected. Here he was. Everybody said he was fearless. He was brave. He was a decorated war hero. He was the highest-ranking officer in the United States Army, and he was terrified that his mother would find out he had a mistress. Now, President Roosevelt once described him as the second most dangerous man in America after Huey Long, who was a senator from Louisiana. I think a lot of that had to do was the fact that the Republican Party, or elements of the Republican Party, were thinking about having him run for president. So Roosevelt probably felt he was a bit of a threat, and I think maybe one of the reasons why he then sent MacArthur out to the Philippines to help organize the first Philippine Army in lieu of their planned independence from the United States, which was scheduled for 1946. Now, I don't want to linger here too much, but I've read quite a few biographies, and I've even read testimonials written by people who had known Douglas MacArthur before, during, and after the war, when he was pretty much leading the occupation of Japan after the war. And all of them really describe him as just a very complex individual, and as well as they knew him, they really couldn't understand him. I mean, he was a brilliant military officer. He's a little bit paranoid. He saw enemies everywhere from the President of the United States to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. But still, when it came to fighting the war and winning in the Southwest Pacific, I think he did a pretty good job. And having read a lot about him, I kind of admired him, but I kind of felt that he was such an egomaniac. I don't think I would have wanted to spend a lot of time around him. But at the same time, I was thinking if I was a young man at this time and I wanted to serve in the military, in the war, but I'd also like to have a good chance of surviving. So I went and did a little research, crunched some numbers, and I came up with some casualty figures, and I'd like to show those to you. But if you compare the Southwest versus the Central Pacific, and even what was going on in Europe under Eisenhower and his lieutenants, in the single battle of Anzio, the U.S. Forces lost over 72,000 men. Eisenhower on Normandy lost over 28,000 men. That's not counting the rest of the fighting in Europe. And in the Southwest Pacific, the little island of Tarawa, a battle that lasted 3 days, the 2nd Marine Division lost 3,000 men, 1/3 of them KIA. Saipan, a battle that lasted just short of 3 weeks. 2 Marine Corps divisions and 1 U.S. Army division during that fighting had roughly 15,000 casualties. On Iwo Jima, the bloodiest battle in U.S. Marine Corps history, they had 25,000 Marine casualties. 7,000 of them roughly were KIA. But if you go to the Southwest Pacific, General MacArthur, in little more than 2 years between the time he arrived in Australia in March 42, until his return to the Philippines, his casualties were less than 28,000. I was recently reading about Eisenhower in Europe, and the Germans were fearful after they had been pushed across the Rhine that Eisenhower would concentrate his forces in a few key places along the Rhine and punch across, and then the Germans would have been through on the Western Front. They were relieved to see that Eisenhower strung his forces all along the Western Front, which literally weakened them and made it more difficult for them to get across the Rhine River. I'm only going to touch on, this is the Australian counteroffensive, if you remember from a previous lecture, if you weren't at dinner at the time. The Japanese tried to take Port Moresby by sea, but they were stopped at the Battle of Coral Sea. That was in May 1942. But they hadn't given up on Port Moresby, so they landed their forces on the north shore, a little village of Buna, and marched over the Owen Stanley Range to take it. They got within sight of Port Moresby before they were forced to retreat back to Buna, where then they were then isolated and eventually reduced. And I don't have the time to go into the details on that. If I had more sea days, I could give a couple more lectures and fill you in on that, so you have to catch me on another Viking cruise where there are more sea days. Okay. Now, the Australians were fearful because of the incredible success that the Japanese had in the first few months of the war. I mean, they bombed Pearl Harbor in December 1941. By the middle of February, they were down in the Dutch East Indies. They had secured their Singapore, Hong Kong. The Americans were bottled up on the Bataan Peninsula and Corregidor, held out until April of May that year. But they were all the way down into the Dutch East Indies, and on 19 February, they had bombed Darwin for the first time, and they had bombed other parts of Australia, and the Japanese submarines, at least in the early months of the war, were busy on the east, especially on the east coast of Australia, torpedoing quite a few ships. So the Australians and the New Zealanders were rightfully fearful that the Japanese would at least land on some of their coastal cities. The Japanese knew, though, they had even argued that, well, if we don't take Australia and or New Zealand, then the Allies will use that as a supply and support base for counteroffensives against Japanese gains made up to this time, and they were correct. But after a meeting in Tokyo about March of 42, they pretty much concluded that they didn't have the wherewithal. Well, most of their military personnel was still tied up on the Asian mainland. They didn't have the men, they didn't have the materials, they didn't have the ships to do that, plus hold what they had secured up to this point. So the alternative was, and I mentioned this in the previous lecture, was to try to isolate Australia and New Zealand by taking Port Moresby, New Caledonia, Fiji, and Pongo Pongo. But with their failure to take Port Moresby, the rest of the plan pretty much fell aside. But then with the Battle of Coral Sea and then Midway a month later, and then the Marines landing in Guadalcanal, they had been pretty much stopped in their tracks, and from that point on, they were being pushed back. There was no more acquiring more territory, and they were having a hell of a time holding what they had gained up to this point. But this map will give you an idea as to why Australians, and I've actually talked to Australians where As children, their parents moved them inland out of fear that the Japanese might land on some of the coast cities. But Darwin was bombed more than once, several dozen times. Broome, flying boats were being used to evacuate Dutch diplomats and their families out towards Australia, as well as some U.S. military personnel. A number of them had landed in Broome, and we're going to take off the next morning to go on down to Fremantle. There were no facilities, though, for them ashore, so a lot of the people just slept on these flying boats overnight. Before they could take off, carrier aircraft, the same ones that had bombed Pearl Harbor, flew in and set them all on fire, killing quite a few of the people on board. And this just gives you an idea of some of the other places that were bombed, not severely, but enough to scare the hell out of the Australians. And this gives you some idea of some of the submarine activity off the coast. We'll talk a little bit about HMNZS Kiwi and Moa. These were British-built Bird-class corvettes, roughly about the size of an American patrol craft. And there were quite a few New Zealanders in the Naval Volunteer Reserves. And when England went to war in 1939, a lot of these reservists went over there and they manned some of these British-built ships. But later, after the Japanese entered the war, some of these corvettes were turned over to their New Zealand crews, and they sailed back to New Zealand and then up to the Solomon Islands to help the Allies there in pushing the Japanese back. So they got there sometime in January 1942, and the Japanese had been pretty much pushed up to the northwest coast by then. But these corvettes were not well armed. They had an old 4-inch gun left over from World War I, and they had a few Lewis guns, but not much else. But the Americans had things like 20-millimeter Oerlikons and 40-millimeter Bofors. And interestingly enough, too, in those days, the British were still wet in the sense that they had a rum ration. And the Americans, since the time of Woodrow Wilson, was dry, which means there was no booze. So they took advantage of this situation. When they got up to Guadalcanal, they took some of their booze and traded it for some 20-millimeter Oerlikons because they didn't think they were very well armed. They were immediately sent up to the northwest coast of Guadalcanal because the Japanese were trying to resupply and reinforce their troops up there by submarine and by destroyers that would come in and shove bales off from the ocean and hope it would drift ashore for the Japanese. Well, they got up there and their sonar picked up a submarine. They depth charged it, wounded it, forced it to the surface, and the submarine was twice as big as one of these corvettes. Now, MOA stood back with their searchlight trained on the submarines that came up, and the men aboard Kiwi with their 20-millimeter 4-inch raked it, killing most of the people on the sail and killing all the men who tried to get and man the deck guns on the submarine. And then the captain of Kiwi, Captain Bridson, ordered the engineering officer full steam ahead. He was going to ram the submarine. And the engineering officer thought he misunderstood the captain. And he says, "What? Are you crazy?" And he says, "No, do what I said. We're going to ram it. It should be good for a week at home." And so they rammed it. He said they not only rammed it once, but 3 times, wounding the submarine further. And the submarine was driven up onto a reef. The survivors got ashore. And I did a little bit of research on this, but 3 members of these 2 ships were awarded the Navy Cross. And according to my research, only 9 non-Americans were awarded the Navy Cross during World War II, and 3 of them were off these ships. The captain of Kiwi, Bridson, and the captain of MOA, Captain Phipps, they were awarded, plus the one rating, his name was Buchanan. He was manning the searchlight, and he was the only casualty. But Admiral Halsey in his autobiography mentions this because he says when they came to receive their Navy Crosses, they were so drunk they had to be held up in order to have the medals pinned on them. One of the people I interviewed too was Jeffrey Fiskin. He was 94 from Rotorua when I interviewed him. He learned how to fly at the age of 14 from some of the early pioneers in aviation in New Zealand. And when the war came along, he was sent to Singapore. And the Americans had these old Brewster Buffaloes. They were considered obsolete even before Pearl Harbor. They were originally designed as a carrier aircraft, a monowing, but they had the new F-4F Wildcats coming in to replace them. They hadn't replaced all of them by the time of Pearl Harbor. Matter of fact, some Marines were flying those off of Midway during the Battle of Midway. But we fobbed them off onto the Finns, who used them quite effectively against the Russians in the Russo-Finnish War of 1939. Are some of you familiar with that rather brief war? A few people? No? None? Okay. Anyway, and they sent them to the Australians and the New Zealanders and the Dutch. Well, they were flying these around Singapore when the Japanese finally started bombing Singapore. They went up to do combat with these Japanese planes, and they certainly were no match against the Zero. And in his oral history, Fiskin said that anybody that tried to get in a dogfight with a Zero usually ended up dead. Even if you could get on the tail of a Zero, they were so nimble they could whip around, and before you know it, they were on your tail. He said the only effective way of fighting a Zero was to gain altitude on it, dive it, get off a quick burst, and keep on diving, because the Brewster Buffalo was much heavier, and a Zero lost a lot of its control if it tried to go into a steep dive. So he made a number of kills over Singapore. He was wounded in aerial combat and managed to get on a ship with some others that managed to get out of Singapore, made it down to Australia, and then eventually back to New Zealand. He was going to go home to see his parents, but thought he should call them first to let them know at least he was in the country. And his mother picked up the phone, and he said, "Hi, this is Jeffrey." And she fainted because the day before she had received a telegram saying he was dead. After he'd recovered from his wounds, though, he was sent to Guadalcanal, and by then they were flying the P-40 Skyhawks, a much more powerful plane than the Brewster Buffalo. He engaged in aerial combat there, and his wounds started bothering him later, so they sent him home. But he had 11 kills and a number of probables, and even when the war was over and he had been out of it for a couple of years, he was still the highest fighter ace in the New Zealand Air Force from World War II. Now, when I interviewed him, he also told me about a Maori airman by the name of Bert Whippety, who, along with his best friend Charles Cronk, were credited with the first shooting down the first Japanese plane in the skies of Singapore. And I later found out that Bert Whippety was from my town, where I live in New Plymouth. He went to New Plymouth Boys High. I went to the phone book, found there were still Whippetys around, and located Leslie Skipper, who is related by marriage, and she was more or less the family archivist. She had all sorts of photographs, documents, and even letters written by Bert Whippety. His high school sweetheart was still around at the time. But then I put an ad in the Napier Papers where Charles Cronk was from to see if there were any relatives, and I got about 3 or 4 emails almost immediately, and one who had a photograph album that had belonged to him. Now, these two are completely different people. For a Maori, Bert was rather diminutive. Charles Cronk was about 4 years older and about 4 inches higher, almost Aryan. Blonde hair, blue eyes, but they went through basic training together, became best mates. They were inseparable. They bunked together, they went on liberty together, they fought together, they flew together in Singapore. They both managed to get out, ended up in the Dutch East Indies, where they flew Brewster Buffaloes for the Dutch for a while until they got chased out of there by the Japanese. They ended up in India, where they were flying P-40s, and sadly, Charles Cronk ended up dying in a flying accident out there. And because of what was called the color bar in India in those days, because he was dark-skinned, he was getting a lot of the colonial types were giving Bert Whippety a bad time. So his squadron commander thought it'd be better as they ship him out, and they sent him to England, where he qualified in Spitfires. And before he died, he qualified as an ace. He was involved in dogfights with some Me-109s off the coast of France near Cannes, and he just disappeared. They just assumed that he was shot down and crashed in the English Channel. He was short of his 22nd birthday when he died. But I had access to letters that he was writing to Charles Cronk's mother. and the letters that she wrote back to him. And even though they had never met, you got the feeling that Bert had sort of become a surrogate son. So she had lost Charles, and then later hearing that Bert was killed too, it was sort of a double whammy for her. I was interested in minorities in the military because the U.S. military was segregated in those days, and also in Australia, not so much in New Zealand. The Maoris were treated much differently than the Aborigines of Australia or African Americans in the United States military in those days. But I did find out that there was one Aborigine who actually flew in the Australian Air Force, and his name was Len Waters. He flew P-40s. I gave a lecture on a Princess cruise, and a woman came forward and said her father was squadron commander, I think it was Squadron 78, and that Len Waters was in his squadron. And she also told me that he wanted to keep on flying after the war but in Australia, but because of his Aboriginal race and the prejudice against Aborigines in those days, he was not allowed to pursue his dream, and he was quite bitter about that. There's also something called the Curtin's Cowboys. This is a nickname for them. But the Australian coast is rather vast and uninhabited, and there was concerns that the Japanese might try to make incursions at various points along there. So they organized a lot of these Aboriginal tribes under Caucasian officers, and they were patrolling the vast coastline of Australia just to make sure that the Japanese weren't trying to come ashore someplace. I tried to interview a number of Maori as I could. Likewise, when I was writing my books about the U.S. Navy, I wanted to interview minorities, African Americans, to see what their time in the service was like, because the service was segregated until the end of World War II. But Tracy Tapuki Megan grew up on a farm in Taranaki. She grew up speaking only Te Reo, which is the Polynesian language there of New Zealand. There are 13 kids in their family. It's pretty much subsistence agriculture. One of her older brothers volunteered for the Maori Battalion and was killed in Italy. She saw this as an opportunity to do something besides work on the farm, so she volunteered for the New Zealand's Women's Auxiliary. She never left New Zealand, but she went down to Wellington and spent the war down there, and for her, Wellington was a big city, all these lights and stuff. It was almost culture shock for her. But her oral history was interesting to me because she gave me a feel for what it was like to be Maori before, during, and after the war. In those days, they got it in their heads that if Maori were going to survive in a white man's culture, they had to forget about their Maori culture and language and become like the Pakeha, which is what the Maoris refer to as New Zealanders of European ancestry. So she said when she started the grade school, if you were caught speaking Te Reo, they gave you the strap. Now, some of you may be old enough to know, even in California, I got my butt beat a couple of times for a number of infractions, and I did make quite a few infractions back in those days. Anyway, so she, in her oral history, she more or less put it that they beat the Maori out of her. And then after the war, there was a change of mind that, you know, Maori culture is part of New Zealand culture, and so there's been a big movement ever since to revive the language, the culture, and that sort of thing. But by then, she had forgotten Te Reo altogether and never got it back. I interviewed Des Turnbull. He's the little guy underneath the blue arrow, but he started off in the Manawatu mounted rifles. It was sort of like a home guard unit. He was in that for over 3 years. And then somebody came along and says, hey, we need more pilots to help the Yanks out. So they literally took him out of the mounted rifles and stuck him in a F-4U Corsair, which was the biggest, most powerful fighter planes to come out of World War II. It was one of the first planes to do 400 miles an hour. It was 14 feet between the nose of the plane and the cockpit, and he was a little guy, and when he climbed into the cockpit, he couldn't see out of it. They weren't very selective. They just grabbed people and said, if you can get through basic flight training, you're going to be a pilot. So, and they didn't have any solution for him, so he had to find his own solution. And what he did was he put a cushion under his butt, one behind his back, and wooden blocks on the rudder pedal so he could fly the damn thing. Well, I interviewed a U.S. Marine who also flew Corsairs, and he was also a shore guy, and he came up with the same solution on his own. Now, I interviewed Charles Led. He was in RNZF number 6 Squadron, and they flew PBY Catalinas. A lot of the planes that were flown by our allies, including the British, were American-made. That doesn't mean the British didn't have their own. They had the Spitfires, they had the Mosquito, they had the Lancasters, any number. But especially in the Fleet Air Arm, a lot of the planes they were flying, besides Spitfires, which was a seagoing carrier version of the Spitfire, they were flying F-4U Wildcats, F-4F Corsairs, Avenger dive bombers. Really, the United States was the arsenal of freedom, if you can look about it. It was in the U.S. industrial output, really, that kept the Russians, the British, and all of our other allies, plus our own forces, in the war, and allowed us to defeat both Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. But he was flying PBYs. There are a number of PBY squadrons also in Australia, used throughout the Pacific. When it was first developed in the early 30s, the idea was it was going to be a new generation of long-range bombers that could take off and land on water as well as land. But of course, by the time the war came along, other planes had come along, land-based 4-engine bombers like the B-17, the B-24, and of course some British built long-range heavy bombers. But still, the Catalina proved quite versatile because it could go out in the morning and stay out all day, come back after dark. So it was great for patrolling long distances. It could land on the water and pick up pilots who had been shot down over water. It was used to bring wounded out. It was used to take supplies to the coast watchers. They had black cat squadrons that would go in at night and cut their engines and come down, drop bombs or torpedoes on unsuspecting Japanese. And it was a terribly reliable aircraft, too, because they had plenty of time between the time it was first conceived and the time the war started to get all the bugs out. Likewise, I've interviewed people who flew PBM Martins. These were another amphibious aircraft. It was bigger, it had smaller engines, and it came online right at the beginning of America's entry to the war, and it had a lot of bugs in it, especially their engines. And everybody I talked to who had flew in a PBM squadron just talked about all the problems they had with it. But everybody I talked to who flew in PBYs absolutely loved them. This is a Ventura bomber. Now, in the early days of the war, the British were desperate to have aircraft of all types, so they went to Lockheed. Lockheed had built the Electra, which was an early passenger aircraft. It was the same aircraft that Amelia Earhart attempted to fly around the world before she got lost in the Pacific and the fish ate her. Some people think she's still alive living with Elvis someplace. I don't know. But anyway, so they took the Electra and they militarized it. They called it the Hudson. The British bought a lot of them. The French bought a lot of them. The Australians were flying them. It was a bit underpowered, so they kind of came up with a souped-up model. It was called the Ventura. And they just had a bigger power plants. It could carry bombs, torpedoes, depth charges. One of the people I interviewed from New Plymouth, he flew in number 1 Squadron in the South Pacific. And they were involved in all sorts. They could also drop parafrags, which were 500,000-pound bombs, where you'd fly in low over the target, you'd drop it, a parachute would open, allowing the plane to get the hell out of the way, and it also had a delayed action fuse. Because in the Pacific, it wasn't like Europe. You could send over hundreds of thousands of bombers and obliterate cities because you were looking for targets in the jungle quite often. So these parafrags proved quite effective. I'll talk a little bit about the 3rd New Zealand Division, because it was well after the Japanese got into the war, and the New Zealanders thought, well, we have to do everything we can to help the Allies. You know, we have the 2nd New Zealand Division, which included the Maori Battalion in North Africa and the Middle East. We've contributed to the naval arm, the air arm, but we should probably put together another division to do our bit in the Pacific. So they put together the 3rd New Zealand Division. But the manpower shortage in New Zealand was so so desperate by that time that they could only get enough able-bodied men to form 2 battalions instead of the usual 3. And at first they didn't quite know what to do with them. At least Bob Dunlap, he was a neighbor of mine until he died a few years ago. He says they've sent some of them to Norfolk Island, thinking, well, you'll be there in case the Japanese try to take Norfolk Island, and that's in the Tasman Sea, somewhere between Australia and New Zealand. And he said, he got there, and he spent the next 9 months helping a farmer milk cows. But the locals were so concerned about all these randy New Zealanders coming in that they shipped all their women from 16 to 60 over to Australia, thinking they'd be safer there, only to discover that the 1st Marine Division was there. So that defeated whatever they had in mind. But finally, they gathered together in Guadalcanal, and they were involved in some landings further up. The Marines had taken Vella La Vella further up the Solomon Chain. Once they'd secured that, elements of the 3rd Marine Division went there as sort of occupation troops. The idea was, originally they were going to invade Rabaul on the northeastern tip of New Britain, because that's where the main Japanese base was for their ships and their airplanes. But they had finally concluded that taking Rabaul would be very time-consuming and expensive in terms of lives, and it would slow down the war effort. So they decided to isolate it by taking islands around it, such as Imaru, Little Mono Island, the Green Islands, and basically they were going to surround it, cut it off so they couldn't get supplies and reinforcements in there. Well, the Japanese thought we were going to try to take it, so they had something like 90,000 troops waiting for an invasion that never took place, and they sat there throughout the rest of the war with not a hell of a lot to do. But this is a photograph of them landing on Little Mono Island. It's probably the only combat that they really saw during the war, and they did take casualties, and most people have never heard of Mono Island because it's only about that big. But they did that. But after that, after Vella La Vella and the Mono Treasury Islands, they didn't have any replacement troops for them. So they decided to disband the 3rd New Zealand Division and send some of them as replacement troops to Europe for the 2nd New Zealand Division. The others were sent home for essential industry, and since Bob was a farmer, they sent him home to farm out the rest of the war. It's interesting, too, because he was in Auckland, and there was some event going on, and he didn't know where it was, so he stopped a young lady to ask where he could find it. Before he could ask his question, she said, "Forget it, buddy. The Yanks are here, and they have all the money." So he didn't have a very good opinion of Yanks at that time. No questions yet. I'm running out of time. You can ask me questions later. Thank you. But this is a map. This is where Vella La Vella was, and then Little Mono Island is just to the south of Bougainville. Dr. Arthur Talbot, he was an ear, nose, and throat specialist. He was a doctor at this time. His father was a doctor with the 3rd New Zealand Division in Guadalcanal. He got word that his father had fallen ill and was being sent home. He was concerned, so he went to the head of the Army Medical Corps down in Wellington and says, "What's this here about my father coming home?" He says, "Yeah, we need a replacement," and you're it. So they sent him up to Guadalcanal. He spent a good part of the war there, working with the 3rd New Zealand Division, but also helping out some of the Melanesians who had multiple medical problems. At the same time, there's another New Zealander. She was up on Vella La Vella as a nurse with some medical missionaries when the Japanese came in, and they had to go into the jungle, and she found herself inadvertently acting as a coast watcher. But when Admiral Halsey found out there was a woman up there, he sent a PBY up there to get her and bring her back, and she worked with Dr. Talbot for because she could speak pidgin. But he said in his oral history, when she stepped off that PBY and came ashore, a lot of the men were joking that they had found Amelia Earhart. And believe it or not, after my book came out, somebody wrote to me and asked me what I knew about Amelia Earhart being on Guadalcanal. Dr. Alan Hayton, he spent the war at Wellington Hospital. And, of course, the Marines were there, and they were getting in trouble, and there were all sorts of minor issues with, a bunch of Randy Yanks and all these New Zealand women around. But one of his colleagues was called down to the emergency department because they said there was an ambulance with 2 dead Marines down there, and they wanted a doctor to pronounce them officially dead. So he did that. And when he came back, he told his colleagues, yeah, there was a couple of Marines in the typical uniform of a U.S. Marine on Liberty in Wellington. They were stark naked, except for contraceptive devices. Apparently, they were being entertained by a young lady when a jealous South African seaman barged in on them. He had interest in the lady, too, so he shot the 2 Marines. And won't go more to that story. But after the war was over, he was sent to Fiji to demob the Fiji battalion because they had taken Fijians under New Zealand Caucasian Command, and they were involved in the fighting on Bougainville. Now, there was a prisoner of war camp in Featherston outside of Wellington. There was another one in Australia. Most of these were Japanese POWs from the Solomon Islands campaign. And in both instances, these Japanese rioted and tried to break out of the camp. A lot of them were shot and killed, and others were wounded, and they were treated in Wellington Hospital. And like I said, the same thing happened in Australia, but some of the Australian troops guarding them were also casualties. Fortunately, in New Zealand, none of the New Zealand troops were casualties. But here's a big Maori guard who seems like he's not going to have any trouble whatsoever with this one Japanese prisoner. Now, I'm going to wrap this up now. I did a pretty good job, better than I thought I would. But when we first moved to New Zealand, we traveled quite a bit around New Zealand. No matter where we went, whether it was a city, a small town, or places where towns don't even exist anymore, we'd always find these memorials to New Zealanders who were lost in both World War I and World War II. Now, this one is a little village of Mo'omata. It's not even much of a village anymore. It's 2 streets. It doesn't have a pub. And if you don't have a pub, you're nothing in New Zealand. Not even a dairy, mom and pop dairy. But I noticed a couple of things about this and other memorials, that for World War I, here I counted over 70 young men from the immediate area who lost their lives in World War I. And you have to remember, these were small family farms. And all these young men and not so young men went off to fight in World War I. Also, on World War II side, I counted a little over 30. One thing I noticed that they had the same surname for World War I, so you kind of imagine somebody lost 2 sons. And also I see the same surname for World War I and World War II, which left me thinking, well, did some woman lose her husband in World War I and her son in World War II? I can also tell you with a great deal of confidence from both Australia and New Zealand, they lost more men in terms of real numbers and percentage of population in World War I than they did in World War II. And now you know a little bit about the contribution that these 2 countries made to the war effort. And I do have some more lectures I would love to give you, but unfortunately can't do it. Sorry. I have another lecture tomorrow. Thank you.